By the end of his first season, Maradona had stopped questioning things. The protection felt normal. The presence felt expected. The people who watched over him had become part of his daily life. But somewhere in that normalcy, something else had quietly taken root. Rules, not written, not spoken, not enforced through threats, but understood. In Naples, there were certain things you simply didn't do. No one ever told Maradona this directly. No one sat him down and explained the boundaries. No one handed him a list of people to avoid or places he shouldn't go. But he felt them anyway. It started with small things, subtle redirections, gentle suggestions that felt more like friendly advice than instructions. Maybe not that restaurant tonight, Diego. There's a better one nearby. That journalist, he's not trustworthy. Better to skip that interview. Those people you met last week, they're not good for your image. At first, Maradona thought it was just people looking out for him. Friends, advisors, people who cared about his well-being and wanted to protect him from making mistakes. But after a while, he noticed a pattern. The suggestions always came from the same circle. The men who had been present since the beginning. The men who nodded to each other across rooms. The men who made problems disappear before Maradona even knew they existed. And the suggestions were never really suggestions. They had the tone of advice, but the weight of instructions. They were delivered with smiles, but there was something beneath the smiles, something that made it clear that disagreeing wasn't really an option. Maradona found himself nodding, agreeing, changing his plans without fully understanding why. It was easier that way. One evening, Maradona mentioned to a teammate that he wanted to visit a certain club in the city. A place he'd heard about from someone outside his usual circle. Nothing special, just somewhere different, somewhere new. His teammate went quiet for a moment. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that feels heavy. "I wouldn't," he said finally. "Why not?" Maradona asked. The teammate shrugged, looked down at his drink. "Just, I wouldn't." Maradona waited for more. An explanation, a reason, something concrete. But his teammate just looked at him. And in that look, Maradona understood. There were places you went, and places you didn't. And you didn't need to be told which was which. You just knew, or you learned quickly. That conversation stayed with him, not because it was dramatic, but because of what it revealed. The boundaries weren't enforced. They were simply there, invisible but real, like walls you couldn't see until you walked into them. Maradona started paying more attention after that. He noticed that certain people were always welcome in his circle. Others were politely kept at a distance, even if Maradona himself had invited them. He'd introduce someone new at a dinner, and by the next week, that person would somehow not be around anymore. Not because anything bad had happened, not because anyone had said anything directly. They just drifted away, or stopped calling, or became unavailable. And when Maradona asked about it, the answers were always vague. He got busy. She moved on to other things. Don't worry about it. He noticed that certain conversations ended abruptly when he entered a room, not because people were hiding something from him necessarily, but because some topics weren't meant to be discussed in his presence. Some names weren't meant to be mentioned. Some questions weren't meant to be asked. He noticed that his schedule, his dinners, his public appearances, his social life, was being quietly shaped by people who never asked for his permission. It wasn't control in the obvious sense, No one was telling him what to do. No one was forcing him. But somehow, decisions were being made. Paths were being chosen. Doors were being closed, and he was following along. Because it was easier than resisting, because resistance would require confrontation, and confrontation would require acknowledging that something was wrong. Maradona wasn't ready to do that. There were also things he learned not to talk about, not because anyone told him to stay quiet, but because certain topics carried weight, brought discomfort, created tension in rooms that had been relaxed moments before. If someone from outside Naples asked about the men who were always nearby, Maradona learned to smile and change the subject. If a journalist asked about his relationship with certain people in the city, he learned to give vague, positive answers that sounded warm but revealed nothing. Naples has been good to me. The people here take care of their own. It was true, but it was also incomplete. And incompleteness, Maradona realized, was safer than honesty. Honesty could create problems. Honesty could offend people. Honesty could make things complicated. Keeping things surface level kept them simple. One night, Maradona went to dinner with a woman he'd been seeing. She was from Milan, from outside the world of Naples. She didn't understand the city the way locals did. She didn't know the rhythms, the hierarchies, the invisible structures that governed everything. At some point during the meal, she asked him a question. "Why are those men always following you?" Maradona glanced toward the door. Two men stood outside the restaurant, visible through the window. They weren't looking at him. They weren't staring. They were just there, present, waiting. "They're just making sure I'm safe," he said. "But did you ask for that?" Maradona hesitated. He picked up his wine glass, put it down again without drinking. "No," he said finally, "but it's how things work here. Don't you find it strange?" He looked at her. She was genuinely curious, not judgmental, just trying to understand. And for a moment he considered telling her the truth. That yes, it was strange. That yes, sometimes it felt suffocating. That yes, sometimes he wondered what would happen if he ever told them to leave him alone. If he ever said he didn't need their protection. If he ever tried to walk away. But he didn't say any of that, because saying it out loud would mean acknowledging something he wasn't ready to face, that he wasn't entirely free, that his life, as wonderful as it looked from the outside, came with invisible constraints, that the love Naples gave him wasn't unconditional. Instead, he smiled. "It's just Naples. You get used to it." And she let it go. But Maradona didn't sleep well that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her question, thinking about the men outside, thinking about how long it had been since he'd made a decision completely on his own. The unspoken boundaries extended beyond his personal life. They shaped who he could be friends with, who he could trust, who he could speak to freely. Maradona had always been open, emotional, the kind of person who wore his heart on his sleeve. In Argentina, that had been his strength. People loved him because he was real, because he didn't hide, because he gave everything, every time. But in Naples, being too open could be dangerous, not because anyone would hurt him, but because openness created exposure, and exposure created vulnerability. And vulnerability could be used against you, not violently, not overtly, but in subtle ways, in quiet ways, in ways that made you feel less safe, less protected, less certain of where you stood. So he learned to guard himself, to measure his words, to think before he spoke, to smile when he felt uncertain, to laugh when he felt uncomfortable. He became careful, and carefulness, over time, became a habit. Then a reflex, then part of who he was. He stopped noticing when he was doing it. The shift happened so gradually that he couldn't point to a single moment when things changed. It was more like erosion, slow, steady, unremarkable. Until one day you looked back and realized how much had been worn away. There was one principle that stood above all others, though it was never stated directly. Stay. Don't leave. Don't talk about leaving. Don't even think too loudly about leaving, because leaving would mean breaking something. Not a contract, not a promise, not a legal agreement, but a bond. Naples had invested in him, the city, the fans, the people who had made his life there possible, the people who had welcomed him when Barcelona had rejected him, the people who had loved him when he felt unlovable. And that investment came with an expectation that he would stay, that he would play, that he would win, that he would give them what they had paid for. Not just goals, not just victories, but belonging. He was supposed to belong to Naples, fully, completely, without reservation. And belonging meant staying. Maradona thought about leaving sometimes. Late at night, when the city was quiet and the watchers were outside, and the weight of it all pressed down on him like something physical. He thought about calling his agent, about asking for a transfer, about going somewhere simpler, somewhere smaller, somewhere he could breathe without feeling observed, somewhere he could make mistakes without disappointing an entire city. But he never made the call. Because leaving wasn't just a professional decision. It was a personal one. A betrayal even. How could he leave a city that loved him this much? How could he turn his back on people who had given him everything, who had made him feel like a god, who had restored his confidence when it was shattered? And more importantly, what would happen if he tried? He didn't know. And he didn't want to find out. So he stayed. And every day he stayed, leaving became a little harder. The roots grew deeper, the ties grew stronger. The distance between wanting to leave and being able to leave grew wider. By his second season, the boundaries had become invisible. He no longer noticed when he followed them. He no longer questioned why certain things were off limits, or why certain people were always present, or why certain decisions seemed to make themselves. It had all become normal. The constraints felt natural. The quiet redirections felt appropriate. The constant presence felt protective rather than intrusive. He had adapted, and adaptation, Maradona realized, was the quietest form of surrender. You didn't fight, you didn't resist, you didn't even consciously submit. You just adjusted, bit by bit, day by day. Until one day, you looked around and realized you were living a life you hadn't entirely chosen. But by then, it was too late to go back. One afternoon, a friend from Argentina came to visit. An old friend. Someone who had known Maradona before Naples, before the fame became overwhelming, before the invisible walls. They sat together in Maradona's apartment, looking out over the city. The friend was excited, happy to see him, full of questions about life in Italy, about the fans, about what it felt like to be worshipped by an entire city. "So, are you happy here?" the friend asked. Maradona smiled. "Yeah, Naples is incredible." "And the people? They treat you well?" "They love me here more than anywhere I've ever been." The friend nodded. He took a sip of his drink. Then he glanced toward the window, toward the street below, where a black car was parked in the same spot it always was. "What's that about?" he asked. Maradona didn't even look. He didn't need to. Security, it's fine. But do you need security? Maradona shrugged. It's just how it is. His friend studied him for a moment, really looked at him. You seem different, he said quietly. Different how? I don't know. Quieter, more careful, like you're thinking about every word before you say it. Maradona laughed it off. I'm just older, more mature. You grow up, you know. But his friend didn't laugh. He just looked at him with something like concern. And after he left, Maradona stood at the window for a long time, staring at the car below, wondering if his friend was right, wondering if he had changed, wondering if the person he was now was still the person he wanted to be, wondering if he even had a choice anymore. The thing about unspoken boundaries is that you can follow them for years without realizing they exist. You think you're making choices. You think you're living freely. You think the life you're living is the life you chose. But slowly, quietly, without announcement or ceremony, the constraints close in. And by the time you notice, they're already part of you. Internalized, normalized, invisible. You don't even see them anymore. You just feel them when you get too close. Maradona had come to Naples to be free, to escape the constraints of Barcelona, to play football the way he wanted, to live life on his own terms, to feel loved without conditions. But freedom, he was learning, was conditional. It was something you had as long as you stayed within the lines, as long as you didn't ask too many questions, as long as you played your part, as long as you kept the city happy. And if you crossed those lines, no one ever said what would happen, because no one needed to. The weight of it was enough. The weight of expectation was enough. The knowledge that disappointing the city, these people, this love, that was enough to keep you in place. In the months ahead, Maradona would continue to follow the boundaries, not because he agreed with them, not because he fully understood them, but because breaking them felt more dangerous than obeying them. And so he stayed. He played. He won. He gave the city what it wanted. And in return, the city held him close, not with chains, but with love. And love, Maradona was learning, could be the heaviest weight of all. Boundaries don't need to be spoken when everyone already knows them. They don't need to be written when everyone can feel them. They just need to be felt. And Maradona felt them every day, in every choice he made, in every word he didn't say, in every door that quietly closed before he could walk through it. If this story left an impression on you, liking the video is enough. For future episodes, you can subscribe.